This is Dr. Annette Feravich with Healthy Mind, Body, Spirit. And you can find me on the internet at www.healthymindbodyspirit.net. And thank you for joining me. If you are joining me, and I am sorry, that's what else we're starting with. We're starting with the I'm sorry that I'm so late. But I did have technical difficulties and way more than that. That's not what we want to do. We want to turn on our www.healthymindbodyspirit.net. But way more than that, what I had I had an unbelievable toothache, and actually it is still going on, but I had it taken care of just a little bit, and thank goodness, because I actually was not going to be able to get on. And if any of you have known or have had a toothache, a real toothache, you know that it could be like incapacitating. You begin to start thinking about, opiates and Oxycontin and things like that. But of course not. I use my natural ways. And this is what I want to also tell you. So actually, and it was a very big help, I used a Rife treatment. And I am now the proud owner of True Rife equipment. And so if you are looking for Rife therapy, I can likely help you in that area if you are in the Detroit metropolitan area, because I am now doing Rife treatments. So make sure that you email me if you are looking for that. You can go to my website and you can check out some times that you can schedule an appointment. But since this is very new, it probably would be a good idea for you to email me at Dr. Feravich, F as in Frank, E-R-A, V as in Victor, I-C-H, at healthymindbodyspirit.net. It'd be a good idea if you wanted to email me. These Rife treatments are amazing. And I have a disclaimer because they are not meant to diagnose or treat any kind of medical ailment. And the reason for that is because there's not scientific evidence, but we're going to talk about that. Why isn't there scientific evidence? Scientists, since we can do empirical testing even if you don't like the things we're testing, right? And that seems to be what a lot of the big problems are right now, is that there are powers that be that don't necessarily like the testing, and if you don't like the testing, then you can eliminate. If you don't like what's being tested, you can eliminate that from testing. And you could say, well, it hasn't been scientifically demonstrated. Well, no, it hasn't been scientifically studied. And why might it not be? Well, as we know, because that's all a funding process. So likely that kind of study is not being funded. Okay, let's take a look at what our topic is for today, shall we? Because that's what we're talking about. We are starting to talk about science today. And so, again, what is our topic? Our topic is a healthy new you in 2022. And so we are trying to get healthy, and the best way for us to get healthy is when we take a look at all of those things. Healthy mind, healthy body. We started with a healthy body, as you know, and we also took a look at a healthy mind. And now we are taking a look at a healthy spirit. And when we're taking a look at a healthy spirit, what we want to take, we've got this for our agenda, but today, you can see there for April 24th. So last week we introduced this topic, and then what we are going to do this week is we're going to delve into it, but I want to take a look at a comparison of science compared to what we're talking about when we're talking about spirituality. And can those two things actually exist together? And most people who are spiritual believers believe that those things can exist together. And why do we believe that those things can exist together? Because we know that we find out science through using our senses. Well, speaking spiritually, we have no objection to using senses in order to better understand science, right? So, as a spiritual person, we do approach what we do and prefer to approach what we do from a scientific method or a scientific perspective. And so that's what we're going to start rolling out here. I am a doctor of psychology, but I've always said that I am a scientist. And as I've said, as a scientist, I take a hard look at the scientific method. And this is what is so upsetting right now about what scientists are telling us to buy, is that they are telling us to buy a one-way path to health that has some science, but certainly is not, comparatively speaking, looking at all the sciences, right? And all the treatments and all the things like behavioral changes as well, because all those things make a difference, right? So are you looking at the spirit, allopathic medicine? Traditional medicine is allopathic medicine, okay? Are you looking at the spirit? Are you looking at the body in relationship to a healthy mind? And absolutely they are not, because pharmaceuticals are really disrupting the normal system of the body. And so if you are looking for something that's different in your health treatment, make sure that you do get a hold of me. And again, Dr. Annette Feravich, Dr. F as in Frank, ERA, V as in Victor, ICH, at Healthy Mind, Body, Spirit. Getting up that sometimes getting those clicks in at healthymindbodyspirit.net. All right, so email me, all right, and you'll find out a little bit more about what wonderful things individuals are doing in healthcare that aren't just looking at one single narrative for their answer, right? Okay, all right, moving on then. So today I want to take a look at, again, some scientific beliefs that are behind or set the foundation for comparison, not for denial, right? We are not denying that science is an important component. What are you going to do? All right. So let's get going on this. Let's talk about science as it relates to our spirit, okay? Okay, so if you recall, here are our resources that we have for Transformation Prayer Ministries and for my transformational therapy. So I always bring up those resources because remember, this is not all my doing. Now, there's a lot of my therapy that is not part of TPM. I incorporate a lot of knowledge that I have with my cognitive and social and developmental degree in PhD in those areas. So I incorporate those things into my therapy, and I think that those are valuable components and they add a lot of rich knowledge. But as far as the actual transformation therapy that I end up using, where you connect to your emotions, a lot of that comes from, or most of that comes from these sources here. Okay. Now, let's define science here. So what is science? And I take a look at Merriam-Webster's dictionary, and then I also looked at Wikipedia, and they agree, and this is the one that I happen to like. So a systematic approach to study that builds and organizes knowledge in the forms of testable explanations and predictions about the universe. So, all right, let's take a look at that and break that definition down, because it's important for us to understand that if I'm going to take a look at spirituality, it doesn't mean that I'm taking a look at spirituality from a perspective that is not scientific. And that's the important point that we want to talk about, right? We approach everything as a scientist. It's necessary because why? Because we have tremendous number of biases, and many of them, unless you've studied them at all, we're not aware of. And even if you have studied them for a lifetime, you still aren't necessarily in tune to how they affect you, when they affect you, or the outcomes of that effect, right? You may think that you've got it under control, right? And that, for example, things like advertisements don't stir you up and make you angry or make you buy things or don't influence us one way or another, but we know that this is a multi-billion-dollar industry that really gets sales, and so it must actually, right? It must actually convince people and persuade them in some ways. Okay, so let's take a closer look at this definition to science. So when we look at that definition, there are 5 major components there that we want to take a look at. So the first one is that this is a systematic approach. Okay, so this is what lots of people sort of scream about relative to, is your method scientific, or whether or not you have science behind your claims. And so science requires a systematic approach. So that is a systematic way to measure variables, or a systematic way to manipulate variables. All right, and so that might be, so if I want to measure your brain activity, I want to use the same measure for comparison each and every time under the same kinds of conditions, right? I want to control for all kinds of things that might influence that actual outcome or that actual measure, right? So that's a systematic approach. So to measuring, right, I want to make sure that if I decide I'm going to measure the size of a person, that I measure all the same places and to determine their size. So all kinds of ways that we measure, we just want to make sure for comparison that we are measuring consistently. Now that doesn't mean my study has to measure the same things that your study does, right? It just means that for comparison, we are looking for like data, right? Like data that is alike, so that for comparison, or one way or another, we manipulate it in ways so that it is actually useful for comparison. Okay, all right. So the first thing then, a systematic approach, right? All right. Now, number 2, we want to make sure that our science is, it says, building knowledge and organizing knowledge. So science should be playing on past knowledge. We shouldn't be reinventing knowledge, right? We should be utilizing past knowledge in order to make future claims. That would be the best approach to science. All right, and then it helps us organize knowledge as well. So this is information that we collect for mental health. This is information that we've collected for physical health. This is information we've collected for spiritual health. This is information that we've collected for, and then fill in the blanks, right? So it helps us categorize and organize knowledge, right? So we might have, for example, knowledge on vaccinated people compared to unvaccinated people. That would be a way to organize and build knowledge in the form of testable explanations and predictions. We call those hypotheses. We test hypotheses. These are our educated guesses, our explanations, and our predictions. Again, but these predictions are what? They aren't stabs in the dark. They are educated guesses that are based on past knowledge. And then finally, they are about the universe. And so our educated guesses in science, they are not simply limited to medical traditional science, but they should be part of an overall exploration of the universe, right? We are not limited in our sciences to simply biology. We really do study astronomy, and we really do study physics. and the physical nature of chemistry, of chemicals. We study the physical nature of chemicals. We study the physical nature of your brain, right? But we also study other things like how those kinds of things operate, for example, right? Okay. All right. So now, what I started to tell you earlier was that I picked up a new machine, which is a true Rife machine. And what is a true Rife machine? A true Rife machine is a frequency generator machine. And what that does is it uses electromagnetic waves in order to combat certain things that are in your viruses, that are in your body. I was thinking about viruses, right? Such as viruses, for example, that are in your body. And what it does is it uses these frequencies in order to destroy these pathogens that are in your body. All right, so this is, and I've talked briefly about this a little bit in the past. These are ways that we actually have seen some success, but the problem is that they have not been tested. These ways have not been tested. Well, there have been systematic ways. They haven't been published, is what they haven't been. So when scientists, it's one thing that scientists actually use all of those methods, but then we have to make the science available, right? So science actually is all about the methodology. However, if I don't have that science presented or communicated in ways that people can understand it and get their hands on, well, then that science doesn't really do me any good either, does it? Unfortunately, though, we cannot get a lot of studies published despite the fact that they end up using that scientific method. And this is a problem with trying to determine whether or not things like spirituality or our spirit, for example, ends up providing any kind of health benefit to us. And in what ways can we train or move our spirit in order to provide health benefits to us? Now, I'm not suggesting that the best way to have a relationship with your spirit is to only look at health benefit outcomes. But what we do know is this, is that you are likely generating a pretty good healthy spirit if you are healthy, right? If you have physical health, you are likely generating a pretty healthy spirit. Which reminds me, this also has been an interesting time as well. Getting ready for this and getting on late is in part because it has been really an exceptional weekend. Friday was the 1-year anniversary of my husband's death, and I spent it with actually both my sons. One of my sons is in Pennsylvania, so we FaceTimed. And during our FaceTime, we played golf. But it was raining here in Michigan, although it's a gorgeous day right now, which I wanted to mention. Thank you, beautiful. Well, I don't know. Thank you, whatever. It's beautiful Michigan and beautiful Michigan weather. And so we are so appreciative when we have beautiful, nice weather. And I would have been outside if my patio furniture was out there, but I don't have my patio furniture out yet. So coming soon, right, as the downtown area all is getting their patio furniture out in anxious anticipation of the weather change here in Michigan. But we plan on golf, and it was not nice on Friday. And so what we did was we did indoor virtual golf while we FaceTime with my older son. So my younger son and I and his girlfriend and her dad all went together. So I was busy with that. So it's been a very busy time, and that's another reason why I'm getting on late is also, but the biggest reason was my toothache. I didn't even think I was going to get on today. And so what did I use? One of the treatments I used was this Rife treatment to help me. And it took 12 minutes of this electromagnetic treatment set to a certain frequency, and you can see there that there's a computer there, and what you do is you plug in your bulb, and it runs then via this computer, and there are bulbs back here. So you plug your bulbs in and you run the program via the computer. And so today what I ran dental pain, and I have to say it worked. I don't know. I have to say, there was other medications, that there were traditional medications that were also involved, but I did not use traditional medications last night when I used it for the tooth pain, and it actually went away, and it came back, but it went away actually for the nighttime. So I think repeated treatments actually help as well. But here you can see a disclaimer there that we have to make, that none of these are scientifically proven. But again, it's not for the fact that we can't demonstrate scientifically some of these things. Why? Because we demonstrate science in a systematic way is what we do. That's how we demonstrate science. And as long as our approach to any part of the universe is systematic and the methodology is explained so that you can replicate it, then that is science. It doesn't matter what you're studying. What science matters is, or what science is dependent on, is how you study those things. Not what you study, but how you study those things. And so I would also like to talk a little bit about some of the things then that are going on that are not, or are going against what we really suggest is, or what by definition is good science. So one of the things that we know, that in good science, what do we do? Well, in good science, we, in order to eliminate biases, we need to test against a placebo. Otherwise, we have what is called a placebo effect. And what is a placebo effect? A placebo effect is that because I believe something might work, and we very often believe, if a scientist tells us, we very often believe that it might work, that the simple belief that something might work actually gets it to psychosomatically actually work. So what do we mean by psychosomatically? Well, our thinking actually changes our body. And so we've seen this in numerous different studies where individuals actually had knee surgery and other individuals actually just had marks, right? So just a little jab marks to demonstrate that there was some kind of puncture, but they actually didn't have knee surgery. And we found out that there was a great placebo effect, that those individuals that actually didn't have the knee surgery, that we have a significant percentage, something like 15%, right, can recover simply because of this belief. We call that a placebo effect. So when we begin to take a look at the some of the problems with traditional science, and some of the complaints that we have about what we see, especially in traditional health, is that they are not testing, for example, these vaccinations against a placebo. And so we may be seeing some increase in effect simply because it is a placebo effect. Here's the thing. You cannot claim to want good science and then not follow good science for your own scientific endeavors, right? For your own biases. That is what creates biases in the industry that science is trying to eliminate. And so what we see here is people say follow the science. However, what we see is in particular with medicine, very poor science. Additionally, have we also been seeing comparative groups, right? We need a comparison group. And what have we seen? Where is the data of vaccinated individuals compared to unvaccinated individuals? We would want to make sure that this data is being collected. But to have one movement, to have everybody vaccinated, and that's the only movement that you endorse, well, that's not good science either. It just simply isn't good comparison science. Okay, so that's what we want to talk about. What we want to talk about is we want to talk about spirituality. Well, the very first thing is can we talk about spirituality from a scientific perspective? And of course we can. We just need to study it systematically. There are scientific methods that can be utilized in order to approach systematic data collection in the area of understanding the benefit of spirituality, which can mean many, many things, right? Believing is not the same thing as doing or acting, right? Talking about love and compassion is not the same thing as acting in a loving and compassionate way, as we, of course, know. Okay, so now, the title of this is, we are talking about science, and we are talking about scientific beliefs, senses, and intuition. All right, so when we are talking about scientific beliefs, we are really talking about an intellectual approach to what we believe, an intellectual approach. And what is required for science in order for us to have good measures is that we engage our five senses in the scientific process, so that when we're measuring, we engage things like our sight, so that we see. For example, if I'm measuring how tall you are, I look at the inches and I make sure that that's a consistent measure. If I am noticing differences in cries, for example, that's utilizing my sound sense. If I want to distinguish facial expressions that are associated with bitter and sour and sweet tastes, for example, I would use my taste sense in order to do that, right? But what am I studying? I'm studying changes in facial expressions that are associated with that taste, right? So that gives me an idea of, when I see that expression, what that expression might mean relative to, for example, disgust. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give you some really different examples of ways that we approach all kinds of topics in science using the scientific method. And in particular, what are we using? We are using our five senses. Now, what our five senses do in particular over time is they help us know what is sort of right and wrong. For example, sometimes we might talk about our eyes as being deceiving, right? That at times we can have optical illusions, which is a perfect example of our eyes deceiving us. I have a wonderful optical illusion that looks at a checkerboard and different gray colors that your mind absolutely says are different, and when you place the grayscale over both of those, you see that they are exactly the same color. You take away that bar, right, that matches those, that color gray, and what you end up having is again, your mind goes back to those are different grays. So even your eyes can sense something that your mind really tells you is something very different, right? Very different. So and even studies done on, for example, smell. Studies that are done on smell can help us better understand infant preferences, right? So we know through studies on and systematically manipulating smells and also interjecting placebos as part of the measure as well. what do? We end up finding out infants have a preference for the smells of their mothers, and that they recognize the smells of their mother within a day, within a few hours. They recognize their own mother's milk, the smell of their own mother's milk. Okay, so these are really interesting and wonderful studies that all take a systematic look at whatever we're studying, a systematic look at whatever we're studying using our five senses. But there are things that really don't incorporate our five senses, right? Like, for example, the law of gravity. The law of gravity. So we don't see that law of gravity that is actually literally pulling something down, but we have been able to measure it, haven't we? Yes, because we know that the law of gravity pulls down something, I believe it's 9.8 feet per second is the rate of gravity, and that is consistent, so consistent every time we measure it that we actually call it a law, right? But do we ever see that or taste it or smell it or touch it? No, but it can be measured. And so this is sort of the little, where's the marble underneath the eggs, right? So this is the game of whatever you call it, switcheroo or whatever you call it. So look under here, making sure that you are only using your five senses in the systematic approach to science, but on the other hand, actually defining laws that are not based on some of those very foundational principles that scientists are consistently limiting themselves to when they say this is the study of science. All right, so what this does then is it helps introduce, in my opinion, it helps introduce then the value in things like intuition. So when you compare intuition is not based on those kinds of five senses. But what intuition can do is intuition can fine-tune for us those five senses. And so over time, what we end up seeing is we end up seeing that something else is part of the mix. Something else besides those things that are truly always measurable in those traditional ways is at work. Now here I have a definition that I happen to like of intuition. There are quite a few different definitions that are out there. And for example, Wikipedia says intuition is the ability to acquire knowledge without recourse to conscious reasoning. Well, no, that's not true either. That's not true. There is recourse to conscious reasoning. Intuition does not necessarily follow reasoning. It has to follow reasoning, because otherwise we would dismiss intuition as always being nonsense, and we can't say that. We can't say that because scientifically it hasn't really been studied to that degree. And certainly we do know that a mother's intuition, for example, of which one is her child's cry may be now attributed to some kinds of genetic factors, and we may be able to understand those genetic factors better, but certainly that is a form of intuition, right? That there is no conscious reasoning that took place. So this can be a definition. It certainly can be a fair definition, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's all encompassing, right? We did find reason for it, right? For that intuition. The reasoning is is that it's in our DNA, right? As we have at least evolved to be able to identify our own children, right? There's some benefit in identifying our own children, especially very early on. Okay, so that's another definition. But the one definition that I really liked the best was psychology's today's definition, and it says intuition is a form of knowledge. So this is a form of knowledge. It appears in consciousness without obvious deliberation. It is not magical, but rather a faculty in which hunches are generated by unconscious mind, rapidly sifting through past experience and cumulative knowledge. And we actually see some of this in action when we talk about and scientifically study heuristics. So what are heuristics? Heuristics are mental shortcuts that we take. All right, well, when we talk about mental shortcuts and we call them heuristics and we talk about those in a scientific way, well, then it doesn't feel like it's so much intuition. But these mental shortcuts really have no conscious deliberation and really are brought about by these hunches that we have, right? That are not deliberated, but quickly quickly aroused, quickly generated, right? So often referred to as gut feelings, intuition tends to arise holistically and quickly without awareness of the underlying mental processes. So these are, we call these automatic thought processes when we're talking about this from a psychological perspective. So automatic processing is what we call it versus conscious processing. Psychologically speaking, though, we know that heuristics, we study heuristics, that these shortcuts can often be better choices than these long conscious deliberations that we have. When we look at the blacks and whites of which ones are better choices, we see that oftentimes gut feelings, for example, a complex choice like buying a home. It is statistically more often the case that individuals who use a gut feeling for buying a home as opposed to, for example, a pros and cons list for buying a home end up being happier with their purchase. And so, why aren't we studying things like intuition? Do we have to house them or cloak them in the idea of heuristics? We do know there's science behind this. We just call these sometimes different names. It's important for us to begin to stop excluding other areas of the universe that we need to study, in particular for health purposes, that go beyond traditional allopathic ways so that we can understand the whole human experience, the whole entire human experience, not simply the biological experience, right? Which actually is housed in many of the hard sciences, right? And even in things like evolutionary theory, right? We need to move beyond some of these biological bases and start taking a look at those things that can't be necessarily explained, but can still be laws, like the law of gravity, for example, right? Okay. Now, let's talk a little bit also. What I wanted to talk about and define here is to look at this definition from Scripture. This is Hebrews 11, chapter 11, verse 1. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So here what we get prepared for, in a way, is we get prepared to demonstrate that there is evidence for those things that we believe with what somebody might refer to as intuition. All right? So again, what are we saying? We're prepared to demonstrate evidence for the things that we believe. So individuals who are spiritual are not, with any thought, stretch of the imagination, opposed to science. We all know that science and our five senses are part of the human experience. And it's a major part of being able to establish objective differences in whatever, right? And whatever we're measuring, and objective differences between me and you, objective differences between this and that, right? It seems to be the best way to measure objective differences. But that, again, should not exclude measuring all kinds of things in the universe in objective ways. This definition from Scripture sets this up to say we should be looking for evidence. We should be looking for evidence for the things we believe that are not seen, because sometimes those are things that we hope for. Sometimes those are things we desperately hope for, that we desperately want, right? And how do we know? How do we stick with it? How do we know that those things are going to be delivered, right? These are the things we really need to study as scientists. It is so unfortunate that we don't study these kinds of things as scientists. We need to. There is no reason from a scientific perspective that they should be excluded from the conversation. The approach needs to be scientific. The approach needs to be an empirical, systematic approach. But as long as it is a systematic approach, we should not exclude anything from the universe as defined by science from scientific exploration and scientific study. So please make sure that you are holding our scientists in every area accountable for what they are calling science. Because if they are not held accountable for what they're calling science, then science is not going to have any meaning. And what I hope for then is that we have a whole new era of universities and institutions that are funded by the students who want to go there, and not funded by big money, big power, not funded by big farm. We need those new universities and institutions, and I hope that people just really honestly give the big middle finger to the other universities and institutions who are not taking science seriously, who are not taking scientific exploration seriously as a science. And it's embarrassing, and it's embarrassing, health professionals, how you are not honoring science. Also, I hope that some of you take a look at the fact that there are certain, for example, HIPAA regulations on the information that individuals are allowed to get and access. However, if that information is accessed, if that information is given and provided through a website, then that information is not private. It does not remain private. So the only information that remains private regarding healthcare is the information that's communicated between you and your doctor. If you communicate information over the web, for example, that information is not private and can be shared with anybody. So this is the reason why places like CVS, for example, or Walgreens all wanted you to register online before you could come in there and take a test, because that information then magically became available to anybody. It was not held to the same privacy rules that your information is that you communicate to your doctors. And so all these individuals who are forced to be tested for vaccinations, all of that goes through, that's data that goes through a website. All the testing information, all of that data now goes through a website, and be aware that anytime any of your health data that is going through a website, All of that health data is available to individuals, and pretty much any individuals who know enough to kind of hone in on what they need to purchase to get this data, because that's what is making money. People want to purchase this data to specifically identify people in their market is what they're doing. And so there's your healthcare data, and there is your healthcare privacy, right? And so we need to keep looking into this regulation of these kinds of privacies because, our personal healthcare information is no longer private. That's all that I have for you today. And so remember, what we are going to be talking about next week is beyond science. Why think about a higher power? So we're going to delve into that a little bit more. Again, today we wanted to compare a little bit about science compared to, can we scientifically study spirituality? We have unequivocally stated yes, we can. And so now we're going to go a step beyond science when we're going to take a look at what is it that we're going to take a look at when we're talking about spirituality. So this is Dr. Annette Feravich. Thank you for joining me. I am with Healthy Mind, Body, Spirit. That is my business. And you can find me on the internet at www.healthymindbodyspirit.net, where you can get great advice and information that nobody's giving you on the internet so that you can just find it there, right? And you can find it on my YouTube channel, Dr. Annette Feravich. Make sure that you like my videos. Make sure that you subscribe to my videos, and please share my videos as well. That's the big thing, is I need those videos shared so the word gets out. And this is a great easy way, even though right now the videos are not edited. When they are edited, it's going to be a great easy way for you to get an entire series on something that really is geared to help you become mentally, physically, and spiritually healthier. Remember that also I am a Shaklee representative, and we're going to be talking more about Shaklee and the importance that has to do with our mind and our body, and even we'll talk more about even our spirit. Okay, that's all that I have for you. Thank you, and enjoy your week.